cram for the exam.
Yo, this is stupid.
I know, right? We could be doing like anything else.
Yeah, I know. Like, we're so rebellious. Let's go get a Pop-Tart. It's like 4 in the morning.
What are you guys doing up at 4 in the morning?
We're just studying APUSH.
Why are you talking?
My name's Jeff.
What are you guys actually doing?
We're just learning about post 9/11 and the wars.
Oh, I know a lot about that. I mean, I can teach you some stuff.
Well, that'd be cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, sit down, grandkids. I have a story to tell you. It all started on September 11, 2001, when 2 airplanes crashed in the World Trade Center because of a couple of hijackers. Now, these hijackers, we call them today terrorists. A third one struck the Pentagon, and the fourth one crashed into a field in rural Pennsylvania. More than 3,000 people died in these air attacks. Now, obviously, there were repercussions from this attack. Obviously, American lives were lost, so the government decided it should intervene, and thus started the War on Terror. 2 days after, the White House announced that there was quote-unquote overwhelming evidence that Osama bin Laden was behind the attacks. Now, at the time, Osama bin Laden wasn't well known, but we know him today, or previously, we know him today as the previous leader of Al-Qaeda. Okay? Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, Grandpa, we already did a little bit of a report about the post 9/11 wars. So far we talked about how Congress authorized, President George Bush to use all forces necessary to fight back this terrorism, and how they established the Department of Homeland Security.
What is the Department of Homeland Security?
Oh, it's a cabinet-level agency that was established in order to protect the United States soil from attacks mainly for terrorism.
Yeah, and they also created the U.S.'s Patriot Act that allowed them to deter terrorists from around the globe.
Nice. So you two know then that the 2 big wars that arose from, as an effect of 9/11 then?
Yes. It was the Afghan and the Iraq War.
Do you know a lot about those 2?
Well, that's where we got to on our report. We were wondering if you could explain it to us.
Fine. I'll start with the war in Afghanistan. Less than a month after 9/11, the United States, with the help of the British, began a bombing campaign against Afghanistan. Now, we did this because we believed that the Afghanistan had connections with the Taliban. So, 2 months later, when we bombed Afghanistan, that effectively started the war in Afghanistan. But then 2 months later, the Taliban collapsed when the American forces took Kandahar, and around the same time, the U.S. also engaged in a fierce battle in the Tora Bora cave complex near Jalalabad in Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden, however, escaped the battle on horseback, so this did not effectively end the war on terror and the influence of Al-Qaeda in the region. Now, the war came to a standstill as the U.S. forces began the reconstruction of Afghanistan in April 2002 and began allocating more resources to the impending threat in Iraq. A man named Hamid Karzai was chosen to head the transitional government in June 2002, but in May 2003, the U.S. announced an end to major combat, which didn't last for very long. Now, in 2004, the Afghan government wrote a constitution, and Hamid Karzai was formally elected president in October 2004, so everything seemed like it was going okay. But then, Osama bin Laden resurfaced.
Oh, I remember that. Didn't bin Laden take official responsibility for the attacks on a speech aired on Al Jazeera?
Yeah, and then in response, Afghan President Hamid Karzai and George Bush issued a joint declaration.
There was some progress after they did that. A Taliban military commander, was killed in an operation by Afghan, U.S. and NATO troops.
Yeah, I remember that. That was in 2007. And then after that, collateral killings mounted.
Yeah, it was a bit of a step backwards. I think there was some gunfire from the U.S. military officials by U.S. military that accidentally killed as many as 140 civilians.
And after that, when Obama came to presidency, he recommitted to Afghanistan.
Okay, so obviously after Obama recommitted to Afghanistan, he needed a new strategy for tackling the problem with Al Qaeda and the Taliban. So, do you guys know anything about the new policy?
No, you should teach us.
Okay, well, he said like his strategy was mainly to get rid of like the safe havens for Al Qaeda or Taliban operatives in Pakistan, and make it more clean, so that he can like track the progress for the progress of Al Qaeda and like Taliban and like the U.S. efforts to like quell that in the region. So he believed that by alleviating like pressure from Pakistan, by providing aid and giving them more help, it would in like turn create more opportunity for, or like not create more opportunity for, but like lessen the influence of Al Qaeda and the Taliban in regions of Afghanistan and Iraq. And as I said before, the temporary or like the president that the U.S. elected when they back in 2002 after they intervened in Afghanistan, his name was President Hamid Karzai, right? And he was completely supportive of the policy because he believed that doing this, he believed in Obama's philosophy that if you target the like since Pakistan was like the main hub for terrorists in the region, then if you could tackle the problem there, then it would lessen the influence of growing Taliban and Al Qaeda forces in Afghanistan and Iraq. So that was the main new American strategy that Obama proposed in his presidential term.
And he also authorized the use of 4,000 troops in Afghanistan.
Yeah, and also Obama called on NATO nations to supply non-military assets to Afghanistan. So they got other nations to help out in this war of terror.
So how do you think Obama convinced NATO to comply with U.S. like the measures that the U.S. wanted to take in Afghanistan?
Well, the U.S. was a really strong presence in NATO, so.
So obviously, the U.S.'s influence in like NATO helped them like convince other countries that it was not just the U.S.'s war on terror, but it was the collective goal of like all the nations in NATO that formed the treaty organization to keep terror
At bay.
at bay. Yeah. Well, NATO helping them develop a civic society wasn't anything new. Well, at least from NATO's point of view, it was something new. But civic society was something that we saw in elementary forms in Afghanistan early on. Primarily on September 18, 2005, when they participated in a mass election of the Wolesi Jirga, which in their language is known as the Council of People, and the Council of Elders and the local council. So, voting for councils was something that was introduced back in 2005. That was, after the United States kind of helped Afghanistan sort of developing to like this basic civil society, but it wasn't at like such a developed form where it like, it still didn't need aid. So that's why NATO kind of stepped in and helped them out. And of course, after committing 4,000 troops, initially, as part of his commitment, Obama in 2009, December 1st, 2009, committed another 30,000 troops to help the effort in Afghanistan, which did prove to be very, very effective because, as we know, eventually in 2011, May 1st, 2011, Osama bin Laden was eventually tracked down and killed by the U.S. military, and people say that was like significantly helped quell the influence of terror because bin Laden at the time was still the leader of Al Qaeda. So Obama's initiative in the long term did work. The United States aimed to help Afghanistan in the way that they approached it by targeting Pakistan as the place where they could shut down terrorist influence and in turn help Afghanistan and Iraq. I know I've been talking a lot about Afghanistan, but it happened in Iraq too. So do you guys know about what happened in Iraq?
Yeah, I remember that in March 2003, President Bush announced the start of a war against Iraq, and it was because of they thought that Iraq was harboring nuclear weapons.
All right. Do you know who the leader of Iraq was?
Yeah, it was Saddam Hussein.
Saddam Hussein. Do you know anything about this? The war in Iraq?
Well, in 2003, Saddam Hussein's rule basically collapsed, and it's been idolized by the fact that they pulled down a statue of Saddam Hussein on that day.
And the cool thing was that it only lasted like 2 weeks.
His rule or the collapse?
The collapse happened 2 weeks after the war started.
Right. After Bush declared war and Alright. Do you guys know what happened after?
Well, I mean, they thought they had this like whole idea that it was like a mission accomplished.
So yeah, since I guess Saddam Hussein's rule collapsed, it like only 2 weeks after, Bush viewed it as like a huge success, right? Like mission accomplished. There were a bunch of banners after the war, and like it was hugely publicized. But in that same year in August, a suicide bomber drove a cement mixer full of explosives into a UN compound in Baghdad, where 19 were killed and several hundred were injured. So we knew that even then the war on terror was far from over in Iraq specifically. But in December of that year, Saddam Hussein, who is now on the run after his rule collapse, was caught in Tikrit in an 8-foot hole at an isolated farm, but he didn't resist for some reason. Probably already knew that he was in a condition where he couldn't run anymore. So the U.S., captured him. He was detained, and when they found him, he was very, very disheveled. Didn't look very good, obviously, because he was on the run. Yeah.
Well, 15 months after Saddam Hussein's removal from power, the Americans transferred the sovereignty of Iraq to its new leaders in a surprise ceremony. It was on the spot. It was called like 2 days ahead of schedule. So it was they were looking to just move that power off from Saddam Hussein to this like new rule of power.
Now I've always been sure about this, but maybe you kids know. Iraq, when we toppled Saddam Hussein's leadership, people declared it as a success. So when did the Iraq War, quote unquote, start again? Or when did it ever stop in the first place?
The Iraq War didn't have like a specific tangible enemy. It just had a bunch of insurgency movements that tried to work against the U.S. forces that were occupying Iraq at the time.
So yeah, it's as you specified, it was a bunch of insurgencies, I guess. So despite that, in Iraq, the death toll for American soldiers was rising and rising. And I mean, in 2005, it was about 1,000 American soldiers were killed in Iraq. And just back at home, back in the United States, people were calling for the recall of the troops, because we believed that the war on terror we believed that it was important, but not to the extent that we were getting involved in Iraq and Afghanistan, because we were involved in both wars at the time. And as after the toppling of Saddam Hussein, the United States persisted in keeping democracy in the region, as they did with Afghanistan. And that was shown in December 15, 2005, almost simultaneously with Afghanistan, when millions of Iraqis voted to elect a parliament for 4 years. Sunni Arabs specifically turned out in what appeared to be a heavy number and in the election, and that was sort of the start of a kind of democracy, as we saw in Afghanistan as well. So there were developments linked with U.S. involvement in Iraq, the same as it was in Afghanistan. So that's still an impact today. Long-term impact of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars is this form of democracy that we see in both countries.
Okay, so on December 30th, 2006, Saddam Hussein was hanged just before dawn in an execution chamber in Baghdad.
So before that, I'm guessing he was imprisoned by the U.S.
Yeah, right after he got captured, he was imprisoned and tried.
Around the same time, a list of American military deaths were given, and they've shown that at least 3,000 since March of 2003 were dead.
So obviously around this time, the American people were feeling pretty
angry with the war effort, and how many lives are being lost in a war that didn't seem to involve us at the time. Alright, so after 3,000 deaths, the U.S. kind of realized that they needed a much better approach. So in June of 2007, they started employing the services of Sunni Muslims who promised to, they trained them with arms, and they promised in turn to combat Al-Qaeda or the influences of Al-Qaeda within Iraq. And that significantly, hindered the process of Al-Qaeda, prospering and growing, and, helped the war effort. But at the same time, there were deaths. In 2008, the death toll again reached another 4,000, and troops started to
recount like the details of like what they were seeing. And a significant example of that was specialist Jerry Ryan King, who after enduring several hundred days of the war experience, decided to retell the events of what happened in Iraq by writing about them. And there's several accounts of this that you can still find today about the experience of the war in Iraq and how traumatic it was.
So after that, on January 5th, 2009, the U.S. Embassy compound in Baghdad finally got opened in an enormous ceremony, and later on in 2009, the Iraqis celebrated the informal withdrawal of American troops from their cities and paraded and made it like a national holiday.
And this was followed by Iraqis going to the polls to choose a new parliament for the country on March 7, 2010.
2010.
And then after that, President Obama then declared an end to the 7-year American combat mission in Iraq on August 31st, 2010. And that he was going to shift his focus more to domestic affairs in the United States.
Which obviously was met with a lot of approval from the American people, since they had been fighting for so long to get the government to notice that this wasn't our war. This wasn't a war that involved us and that was worth sacrificing troops over, as I've said several times. So Obama declaring finally that the war was coming to an end, and seeing that troops were suddenly being withdrawn from cities in Iraq, which was met with celebration by both the Iraqi people and the United States citizens, was obviously a good thing to see nearing the end of the Iraq War. So after the war ended in Iraq, as you know, Obama ended it. There was an incident with WikiLeaks where people were posting details about people who died, and how everyone detained during our involvement in Iraq. So it shed light to the American public about the true atrocities that were committed during the wartime period. But people didn't feel as strongly about it now, since the war was over. But there was still some objection to getting involved in the first place. And that was seen throughout, after that's seen today, people talking about, whether the Iraq War was really worth it, given the, costs and the outcome of the war, but we'll get to that later. But the most positive thing that came out of 2011 in terms of the Iraq War was President Obama announcing that the last soldier would be officially removed, or the last American soldier would be officially removed from Iraq, and by the end of the year, which would, completely devolve or completely withdraw U.S. from Iraq. Since they had some sort of stable democracy now, the U.S. being involved so many years, and they didn't see the point in, more occupation of the, territories, now that they also had declared that the war effort was over. And that was really the end to the war in Iraq, after President Obama announced that the last American soldier would be there. And by the end of the war, I'm not sure if you two know this, but 4,400 troops were killed by the end of the U.S. 4,400 U.S. troops were killed by the end of the war, by the time the last troops came in, and over $1 trillion was spent, and that obviously caused some sort of economic ripple in the world economy and our own domestic economy. So basically, those were the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, which were the two major conflicts that the U.S. was embroiled in during the post 9/11 period. You guys have any questions?
Well, how much did the war cost? I mean, it seemed like it was a long time.
I mean, yeah. So, the war effort itself, combined, both wars combined, was about a total of $6 trillion on the U.S. So, there was a lot of economic impact on the United States in terms of, money that it costs, and, that whenever the U.S. economy is affected like that, we also experienced recessions during the 2008 period, and, that we still spend money on the war, which is, again, why people thought that, despite the lies less, people thought that we were spending too much money as well. We were in an economic downturn. We were spending a lot of money on the war effort for the war on terror, but people didn't see it as important. So I guess it's comparing the outcomes. So in the end, Afghanistan and Iraq were not completely rid of you know, there's still like influences of, or like signs of, you know, terrorism in Afghanistan and Iraq still, you know, it's not like completely red, you know, there will always be some sort of, you know, influence, you know, it exists in the United States as well, but in the end, there were democracies in both countries because of U.S. intervention, and, you know, the fact that we were able to bring in NATO and, you know, convince all these other countries that, you know, it was worth bringing, it was worth bringing in all that aid to, you know, Pakistan, to Afghanistan, Iraq, and, you know, help out these countries instead of, you know, turning our backs on them and letting them handle it. Because for all we know, if we didn't do that, you know, the regime of Saddam Hussein, the power that, you know, Osama bin Laden wielded with Al Qaeda could have risen to unimaginable levels, where, you know, the U.S. would eventually have to get involved, and maybe it vaulted at a point where we couldn't really do anything about it. So, in terms of effects, those are really it. You know, the drawback was the economic costs, and the benefits were, you know, that we significantly reduced the risk of terrorism, and you know, the fact that we helped out two countries that seemed, you know, hopeless at the time, that were dictated by, you know, people who use terrorism as, you know, the main instrument to govern countries. You know, that now they have democracies. So that's basically, you know, the war on terror, post 9/11, you know, wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, major events. You guys have any questions?
No.
Okay, well, I hope you guys learned a lot, and it's 4:24 in the morning. Wow. I probably should get back to sleep, you know. I gotta go to something tomorrow.
Thanks so much, Grandpa Sandy.
Yeah, no problem, buddy. Alright, well, good night, guys.
Alright, see ya.
Alright? Give me a high five.
Have a hug, Grandpa.
Hell no.
Aww. Aww.
Hey, Shiva, guess what? We can finally go eat Pop-Tarts at 4 in the morning.
Yo, we're so rebellious.
Yeah! We're so cool. Let's go.
No, we're not.
It didn't play.
In order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such... Wait, what the...
Cut.
Fuck that. Less than a month after 9/11, the U.S. military, with the help of British support, began a bombing campaign against Afghanistan, which started the war...
I need some cups.
Action. Yeah, I remember that, and he also authorized an
Action
initial...
potential.
The Bush administration also called on NATO nations to
It's Obama.
Bush.
Oh yeah, Bush.
Bush was president back then.
In 2000.
Good job, Shiva. Yeah, 2009, Bush was president. Alright, so, yes!
We're getting